Welcome to Off Panel, Sketch.com's weekly podcast. This week, our guest is a return visitor to the show, as I Hate Fairyland, Skottie Young comes back to talk about the second arc of the book and a lot more. Thanks for coming on, Skottie.
Hey, thanks for having me back, man.
So I kind of fibbed a little bit in the intro because I said I was going to, talk about the second arc of I Hate Fairyland, and we're going to get into that here in a bit. But I want to start with something a little bit random.
Okay.
Having this isn't actually the weird question I was starting with, but having followed your social presence for a bit and getting to meet you at Emerald City this year, and get to see what you're like, interacting with fans and everything like that. Something kind of, something really stood out to me. While I think most comic creators do, it seems to me that you really, really love what you do. You love being a cartoonist. You love being an artist. Would you say that's a fair statement? Is being a comic artist something you just feel like emotionally compelled to do, basically?
Yeah, man, it's just awesome. I get to, I say this a lot, but I get to play pretend for a living.
Yeah.
I get to wake up in the morning and put my kid on the bus and, get in my car and go to a room that's painted bright orange and green and filled with toys and countless books. And I get to take blank pieces of paper and make things up. I literally get to play pretend. And then somebody gives me money for that. So, just on that side, you can't get cooler than that. So it's hard not to enjoy.
Yeah.
It's, and then, on top of that, then, like you said, we got to meet each other in person at a convention and I don't know if I can quite describe how bizarre and cool and strange and exciting it is to go to a building randomly after spending a couple months by yourself in a room, and then you go to a building where tons of people want to just say hi to you or get a book signed, or they're happy to meet you, or they're scared to meet you, or sometimes they're mad to meet you, whatever. But it's never in a million years would you think that you'd be in a position to where people, strangers, people that you don't know, you're a part of their lives. Things that whole thing where I said about going to a room and playing pretend, that becomes a part of someone else's life. And I know that it does because hundreds and hundreds of writers and cartoonists are a part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
My family will tell you how filled with books every single corner and crevice of our house is. So the fact that I get to play that role for someone else is it's just awesome. It's so cool. And there's times where you can start feeling a little you can get a little jaded here or there, but it does not take me long to kind of smack myself in the face and be like, really, come on. This is about as cool as it gets. Something that I said when I was a kid, or a high schooler, to be like, oh, I want to do this when I get older. And that's what I'm doing. It's hard not to say that I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny, listening to you describe, going to a room that's painted orange and green, and you have toys everywhere, and you have you get to draw your stories and everything like that. It kind of reminds me, when I was a kid, I always thought that peak adulthood was Josh Baskin and Big. And,
oh yeah.
Yeah. And it kind of sounds like, I'm not saying you're sitting around and playing with Transformers all day or something like that, but it kind of sounds like it's not that you're childlike or something like that, but you get to embrace these things. You get to tell stories about things that you imagine for a living, so you can have all these people talk to you about, I don't know. It's cool because I don't know, something like I Hate Fairyland, you're a creator-owned series that, you finished the first arc on. Now it's not just, not saying that your other work wasn't great, but it's cool. This is a world you have created, and people get to come up and talk about how exciting it is that they get to read a story like this. And that's got to be really fulfilling.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. To no end. In a lot of ways, it's funny that you bring up Big, right? Because I Hate Fairyland is not that much different than Big, right? There's a lot of Big in my book. That's a lot of that, those themes are the same themes that I'm dealing with, right? Obviously in a much more cartoony, violent way, but that whole theme of Big, it was this adult with a child inside of him, and kind of reminding kind of like a picture of what adulthood is be like, and it doesn't have to be like that. It can still be filled with kind of imagination and joy. And obviously Fairyland, I'm examining the opposite of that, basically those two, Big and I Hate Fairyland, like if they met in the middle, it'd be a normal life, right? Because it's like, I kind of feel, some days I feel like Tom Hanks and some days I feel like Gert, where it's like, I feel like I'm a kid. I feel like I'm an adult trapped in a kid's world sometimes because of the kids and my job and all this stuff. But then there's days where I feel like a kid inside of an adult's body. Like, I can't believe today I'm going to decide, like, you know what? I'm just kind of stuck. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to watch some episodes of Teen Titans Go. Or like, you know what I mean? I'm going to stop. Like yesterday I stopped and I was like, you know what? I think I'm just gonna watch Ralph Bakshi's Wizards today. And that's gonna be studying. Like, that's gonna be research or something. Like, that is very much exactly Tom Hanks. Playing with the toys. It's definitely a bizarre. It's a bizarre way to live your life, but I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah. No. And the funny thing is I'm not to get into taxes, which is pretty much the opposite of what we're talking about, but it's like, sure. I imagine as like a cartoonist, you could even like write things like Ralph Bakshi's Wizards off, because it's like, that's like research for you or something like that. I mean, it's
100%. I mean, books and art books and all that type of stuff. I mean, these things are, invaluable reference for me to know how to do what I do,
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. For sure.
It's like when I tell my wife, I'm like, I got to read these comics so I can write about it on my site. This is important. This is work. And she's like, I don't think that's work.
Yeah, it takes a long time to convince the rest of the muggles that we hang out with that that what we do is for real. Like, no, I promise you, it's okay that I'm wearing these pajamas to the office. It's okay. I promise.
So I wanted to actually, you kind of tied into something I was going to ask about. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about the first arc of I Hate Fairyland is the idea that it's like, it is like this mythical dreamland in many ways, but when you get the chance to live that dream, it's not all it's cracked up to be. It's like too much of a good thing really can be a bad thing. Like, there's that one spot where I think it was in the second issue where Gert wishes she looked normal while she was drinking that Wisher's ale, and then all of a sudden she's got type 19 diabetes. Right. And it's like a hilarious moment, and it's like such an accurate statement, because if you ate candy for like 30 years, you would probably be super unhealthy. But is that something you're interested in exploring personally? Like, kind of like the too much of a good thing really can be a bad thing. Like, if you're immersed in this world, maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a thing that definitely is at in some ways that this book is dealing with. I mean, and these come from real places. I think we can all say that we've experienced something like that, if not all the time, right? I mean, when we're young, I've always been a very tall person, from a kid, right? I was 6'2" as a freshman in high school and 6'4" by the time I graduated. And so, I'm a big kid growing fast, high metabolism. And so, it was nothing just to eat large pizzas in one sitting by myself, and down, as much Mountain Dew as one could buy in a day, and without any kind of repercussions. Right. And at some point you keep living life like that, which I did. And then, at some point in my mid-20s, I looked around, I was like, wow, like, my body's not agreeing with this living like a child situation, right? Like, I'm still making like childlike decisions with my diet and all those kind of things. And all of a sudden my body's starting to be like, oh, no, you probably shouldn't do this. Like, things aren't going right. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that I think is, obviously, I Hate Fairyland is. I will never claim that I'm diving deep into any sort of, examining the psyche of people. I don't like, but I would say there's definitely some. I think any kind of comedy or any kind of, there's a lot of truth in jest, right? Like, I think is the saying. So I think anytime that we find something to kind of poke at a little bit, there's usually some truth lying under there somewhere, and it came from a place, So a lot of the things that I make fun of a lot are, a lot of times I'm not really making fun of other people. I'm usually poking fun at myself. And I think a lot of this book is me. There's a lot of my life in this, which is, a grown up and, at times can be a little childish and at times can be very tunnel visioned and very, selfish and but also absolutely filled with joy and be obnoxious. And so there's a lot of things I think that are in this book that I'm probably examining and poking this bear more than I'm doing it to anybody else or casting or throwing stones at anybody else's anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Actually, so I'm rereading Fables right now. I don't know if you ever read Fables, but
I think I read like maybe up to like 12 or 13 or something like that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So there's this one, like, it was like, I think the second trade, or actually, no, I think it was the first trade, and it had Pinocchio, and he was talking about how much it sucks to be eternally young. And it's funny because, like, like before reading, like, I Hate Fairyland, like, people think all the time, you think about like Peter Pan, or you think about like, oh God, I almost made a Twilight reference, and that was going to get really dark for a second. But, but like the prospect of being eternally young is something that people like talking about. And it's like, I don't know. That's the interesting thing is like, it would kind of suck to be Gert, but at the same time, like, that's kind of like, that's where you have a lot of fun with. And I think that's really great. Like, I think it's not that you're like torturing Gert or something like that, but she's such an interesting proxy for this world because she's like so over it. And it's like,
right.
I think you get a lot of really great mileage out of that. And a lot of great humor comes from her as just being this like, okay, this was a cool idea, but like now after, what is it, like 37 years? Was that?
Yeah, it's like I think 27 years.
Oh, 27
but yeah,
years,
like
yeah.
I think within my story, I start adding years, and I may lose track. I don't have the Spawn time hourglass counter.
But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of funny because it's like you think about how cool it'd be to be like young forever, but then you're like, wait, now I'm young forever. You're like, I'm kind of over this.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to kind of unpack a little bit, because when you're young, you think you just want to be old, right?
Right.
Like you just want to get older and then you hit this place where you're like, well, man, if I could just be at this little stage where all we do is party and all we do is hang out and it's all fun and games. But to be honest, I mean, as I've gotten older, I'm having more fun. Now I'm by having more fun, I mean, I'm more content, meaning like, so I'm not going out more. I'm going out far, far less, but I'm more content because I'm more focused and I know who I am and I know what I want. And I'm hungry to learn more. So there's all these things that I enjoy more because of like things have just calmed down. And so it's funny, like I could see why maybe, at a certain point, like Gert feels, like there's these feelings of like, I'm ready to stop now, but I'm in a place where I can't stop.
Yeah.
And I'm in this body that won't let me stop. And people won't treat me like I'm ready to stop. Right. Like, I don't know. I think there's an interesting thing of people who kind of even look eternally young. Like people who are still getting carded in their 30s or something, or like 38 years old and still getting carded. Is that like, some people might be flattered, but I imagine at some point that's kind of saying like, don't you think I look mature enough to be an adult? Like,
yeah.
You could, because like I've worked my ass off to get to this place where I probably should be an adult. There's a lot of things working towards each other there that I think is interesting. But I mean, honestly, a lot of it comes at the end of me making it. Like I think that there's a lot of gut things that go like I'm just having fun and I'm telling these stories and these concepts kind of pop up, and that's why I say there's probably a lot of truth lying under the surface that I don't know that I'm putting in there, because I'm just putting in like these ideas that hit me and like, oh, this would be a fun thing to look at. And then when it's all said and done, I've made it, and like the colors come in and I'm starting to look at the lettering and approve the pages and stuff. I'm like, that's when I start seeing like, oh, there's some like I've got some problems maybe or whatever, right? Like you start seeing it's a lot easier to apply, deeper thought after it's said and done. Sometimes I have in mind, like definitely the Wisher's Ale thing was something, one of my very first early ideas with this was one of the issues that I would see being a problem. Yeah, the rest of it is a lot of things where you just have an idea and then you're like, I wonder where that idea from. And I think that's a lot of us in regular life, right? Where we do things and we don't really know why we do them at first. It's not until we are forced to examine it later, like, why did I do that? And then you realize, like, oh, it's because I hated my mom, or whatever. So yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that I can go back in Fairyland now and sound really, really smart. Like, oh, well, what this really means is, yeah. So
it kind of sounds like I mean, I know that in the first arc specifically, you had everything like full script and everything. You had that really planned out, but it kind of sounds like you're. I mean, I saw on Twitter you said that you had scripted an upcoming issue of I Hate Fairyland to be 20 pages, but when you were actually drawing it, it ended up being 26 pages when you were done. And it kind of sounds like you're, I don't know, kind of riffing on the page, like you're kind of figuring it out and you're finding where the story takes you as you do it. And I think that's pretty great. Like, how much of the book do you figure out on the art stage, I guess?
Well, what's funny is the first arc too. The first arc was all written as 20-page issues. So all 5 issues the scripts were 20 pages. And I think by the end, when they went to get published, first issue was 24, the second one was 22, the third one was 28. So it was like, again, I still added pages to every issue when it came to the art side. So I would say that story-wise, on the first arc, I figured out the entire first arc and wrote it all before I drew any pages. So I wrote all 5 issues before I drew any pages at all. So that was simply because I didn't know, I didn't know that this would make it. And I didn't, so you have a world set up to go on forever, but it's also, I'm going to tell a story that if things don't work out, it can end at 5, So I had all that worked out. And then anything I added there was simply ideas that came up on the fly. And most of the time it was like, in issue 3, I had the idea with, Gert gets knocked out and she's laying there and Larry's like waiting for her to wake up, and all the, time starts going by, and all of a sudden, over the course of 8 pages, Larry basically, builds a home.
Entire life.
Yeah, he lives an entire life. Like, gets married, has kids, loses them because he becomes an alcoholic and burns his house down. And then finally Gert wakes up. And that started off. Yeah, it has to shave Gert's beard. But the original script and even the pages, I penciled that first. I did the thumbnails. It wasn't until I was penciling that I came up with the next part. And my next part was the original was Gert got knocked out, and then you turn the page and it was X amount of time later and she's awake. So it was while I was penciling, I was like, this beat is fast. Like it just, I don't feel like there's not a punch there. And then I thought about it and I was like, wow, if I do this, I've got to add 8 pages. And so it worked out because I was like, well, if I add 2, I've got to add 2 more, but then like, that's not enough. So I was like, well, if I want to do this, let's just do it. So yeah, stuff like that. Yeah. You just add on the fly. And then other times it's not necessarily as much of a story ad. It's okay, I told the story. The story is what it needs to be. It's tight like I want it to be, but I could sure use I could use more space for this scene. So, I just do the math and I'm like, okay, if I need one more page here, then I've got to add another page another just for the publishing, to make sure that the page count works out. So a lot of times it's just like, man, this fight scene could look cool, or like the issue that I was working on this time was like I had a 5-panel page, and one of those panels on the 5-panel page was a kid looking at a giant, like a really big, slushy machine at a convenience store, and that was just one panel of a 5-panel page, and there really wasn't a lot of focus on it, and it was part of a whole. It was a little part of a big whole, and I thought, man, I really want this panel to sing. All right, so I'll just make it I'll add 2 more pages and I'll make it a double spread. And so it's really a lot of choices to decompress visually, where I know a lot of times in comics, because we kind of write for trade and we're kind of trying to spread these stories out, that we decompress the story and kind of slow the story down a little bit. But a lot of times I want the story to go faster, almost like more manga almost, where the stories go fast, but it's the visuals that are decompressed. You have the pages don't have as many panels. So you add more pages to get the same information across. You're just doing it bigger, more focused. So yeah, I still work out and I still write full scripts for myself every issue. Like today I wrote, I wrapped up issue 8. So before I launch into the arc, I usually have at least the concept for each issue planned out. If not, a couple scripts already written before I start drawing the first one. But now that I'm writing and drawing my own, I will usually, at least like this second arc, I wrote the first script, and while I'm drawing the first script, I'm writing the second script. A couple hours here and there at night. So after the kids go to bed, and my wife is editing photos or something, we'll sit there. She's on her computer, I'm on mine. We're watching, whatever show we're watching, and I'll do a little scripting while we do that.
I think it's really funny that you mentioned that like 8-page segment you added in where like the whole life playing out and everything, and because it's like that's that type of thing, like the thing that you just feel compelled to add in because like it didn't have enough punch. Like those were like actually like that moment right there was like one of my favorite moments of the first arc. Like it made me laugh, and it was just so unexpected, and it was like because I like as a reader or as a person who engages with stories in general, you're used to like that moment, like you're used to like the next scene taking place being Gert waking up. Instead, it's like you get this whole situation, and it just makes it so much more absurd and so much more funny that like I don't know. I mean, like those were the parts that actually really made. I mean, not that the rest of the book isn't good, but like it makes I Hate Fairyland feel as special as it does because like you just give those moments that much room to breathe, and I don't know. I'm glad you did.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of doing creator-owned books at a place like Image, right? I mean, I love that place because it truly is your business. Like Image publishes your book, but you run a small business within that publisher, and by that I mean whatever page. I picked 32. 32 pages is my page count. Which means there's 28 interior pages to deal with, and not including the inside covers or whatever. But you can use those for story. You could use the back cover for story if you want, as long as you don't go past the real estate that you have set up for the printing. I mean, and that was that issue. I used every available page. Excluding the inside and back covers, I used every interior page for that issue because the idea, like you said, the idea hit me. And I remember that day I called up Jason Howard and Riley Rossmo, and, we talk on Skype a lot while we work. And I ran it by them. I was like, is this funny? Because I was like, I think this is funny. I said, this is either people are either going to think this is a super genius move or I'm going to be called a hack because it's going to be 8 pages of stat panels, right? I mean, it's going to be virtually the same drawing over and over with a tiny variance at the top. But I was like, I'm pretty sure it's funny. I think it's funny. And of course, they both were like, oh, that's great. So, and that's another thing, man. You just get to have fun and you make up things on the spot. It's and as far as, I've got Jean-Francois Bilot and Nate Picos on letters, but outside of those two, like as long as I don't ruin their lives with the choices I make, I'm beholden to no one, So it's like, yeah, it's great to be able to add stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure sometime I'm going to try something like that. It's going to come back and bite me in the ass, but until then, I want to keep trying because that's kind of I figure again, but kind of my motto is I want to try things here that I could never do at one of the big publishers, and not because they're bad. It's just because there's a system in place there, right? And you gotta fit within that system. And I've been very good at doing that as well. So, but I figured if I'm gonna do a book outside of that system, let's do a book that can only exist outside the system,
Yeah, and I, like you were talking about like your collaborators. I was going to mention one thing I really liked in the first arc was when Gert was drunk and her like lettering kind of gets all wavy and everything like that. That was such a nice little touch. I don't know. I was like rereading it earlier and I came across that and I was like, oh man, that was really good. But I was going to actually ask you, so like, you have this freedom from doing this project creator owned. It's your baby. You can add pages. You can do stuff like that. Do you ever get to a point where you're like, am I just adding this to add? I mean, like you were talking about, like, you weren't sure if that 8-page segment was going to work out, but like, is there like kind of like a fine line you got to walk where it's like you don't want to add too much because then it just keeps getting bigger and bigger?
Oh, for sure. And yeah, and there's been a couple instances where I took away, where I had an intro that was, 3 or 4 pages and ended up just chopping it down to one. In fact, I mean, the first issue, where Gert is in her bedroom and gets sucked into the floor on that first page, that used to be like a 5, like her getting to Fairyland was like a 7-8 page sequence, where by the time I published it, I actually did the opposite. I cut everything because I thought that's not quick enough. Like it's too much. I'm getting too indulgent in these things I want to draw, because I wanted to have her do this and then I wanted to have her do that and do that. Now, luckily, I've been able to repurpose some of those ideas for things coming up, and plan it out, because now I'm in a place where I do want some things to be a little slower here and a little quicker there, but it was the beginning. So you make different choices at different spots. The choices I make for issue 1, I don't make for the same for issue 6. I make a different choice, but for sure, that's always going to be a balance of where do I indulge, where do I go crazy, or where do I cut and where do I pull back? There's always going to be a balance, and I'm not always going to get it right. And, sometimes things are going to work out and sometimes they are, but that's kind of also the beauty of comics, right? It's a 20 to 30 page story, and there's going to be another one in 30 days.
Yeah.
So I might nail it this time. I might absolutely blow it, but I got 30 days to try to get to make up for it again, so that's kind of the beauty where comics, where it's not, I didn't spend 5 years crafting a novel and then when you read it you think, wow, what a way, I don't have to feel like it's like, shit, like I blew that one.
Yeah.
But maybe I can save it on the next round,
No, that totally makes sense. I mean, it's like, if you're like trying to write the great American novel and nobody likes it or something like that, and then you're like, oh God, now what am I going to do? I have to write another novel, I guess. But that is nice thing about comics is it's kind of like, I don't know, I always compare it to TV because they're both serialized fiction, but it's like, there may be like a bad episode every once in a while, but like, that's one of the interesting things about both comics and TV today is like there's just so much of it. Sometimes I feel like people have like shorter leashes with like how long they go with stuff. But I don't know. I was reading this article today about from this one TV critic I really like, and he was talking about the TV show Person of Interest and how he originally watched it for like the first little bit and he's like, whatever, it's generic. And then he had some people tell him that he should get back because like it's gotten really good and the final season's coming up. And he went back to it and he realized that like, because of this peak TV thing, like sometimes you can miss like good things becoming great things. And I don't know. I mean, it's like, I think it's great that you, I don't know, that you feel freed, like you have good freedom to be able to like approach the story how you want. But I wanted to ask, it sounds like, like you were talking about how like your approach for issue 6 and issue 1, like while they're not different, like it kind of seems like you've learned things in the process. Like, what do you feel you've learned about creating your own book, like head to toe, since you started working on I Hate Fairyland?
What I've learned, I've learned a lot of different things in a lot of areas of making comics. But I'll just start with the straight up, storytelling. I've learned that I like to have somewhat of a plan, but I like that plan to be loose to be able to pivot along the way. Which by that I mean the first arc, because I didn't know that it would do well or if people would accept it or if it'd work. And I had it written as a 5-issue story. It was planned out to the T, and it had, the ending I had from the very beginning. And so I was always aiming at that target, and I wrote the whole series. I wrote all 5 issues at once. So it was all written for a while before I started drawing it. So as I was going through drawing it, I had a blast, but it didn't feel as fresh because I had been sitting with it for so long. And I always feel like the longer you sit with something, the more you start questioning it. For me, these are all. I need to state that whenever I say these things, these are always things that I'm saying about me, not the medium or how people should work. For me, I do best when it's like you throw it out on the table, and I deal with it right then, and then I move it aside and I move on, because if you give me too much time, I'm going to find all the flaws, all the problems, and then I'll start chipping away at it too much. I mean, that was probably one of my biggest hurdles, and this is another thing I've learned, was the thing that took me so long to finally jump into the creator-owned arena was that I treated every idea and comic and comic idea that I had as so precious that I would work it and rework it and rework it, and kept saying it's not ready or it's not perfect. And for me, now some people that really works because that's the way that they build things. But for me, my brain kind of works like I've learned that if I have ideas, just go ahead and put it down and see what happens, and then have another idea, So now that I've stopped kind of being so precious about making comics, I'm having more fun and I'm telling stories on the fly. So, I mean, the thing that I'm doing with the series, that's a slightly different than the way that the first arc was, is it's a lot more free roaming. Meaning each issue is going to feel a little bit more like its own story within a grander story over time. It's gonna feel more like a television show than a movie. Where I think sometimes a 5 or 6 issue arc can feel like a movie, or like a really tight drama, where you got the 13 episode seasons now that, it's like you could never jump in and just watch episode 3 of something anymore. Right. But, I still love shows like Buffy. I was a big Buffy fan, or the West Wing, or, shows that were, you could kind of jump in. You could watch almost any episode of Buffy within a certain number of seasons. And just basically enjoy that. And yes, they might drop little story hints here and there, and you might be lost for a second. But I think that's how comics were when I grew up too. Like, I never had a jumping on point. I just jumped in, but it never felt like it was so entrenched in a huge, huge arc that I was lost completely. And because this is a humor book, I've learned that I think humor books for me need to stay nimble. I need to be inspired closer to the time of making that issue, making that book, so it stays fresh, and it's kind of it's what's on my mind there, and it also doesn't get bogged down in being too much of a quote unquote real comic. And I don't want to say that disparagingly. I really mean, like, I don't want there to be any confusion. Like, I don't want to pretend that I'm in the middle of some heavy, deep, spider-webbed plot, because that's not this book. This book is it's episodic comedy. You're
not going to enjoy my article next week where I'm digging into the themes of I Hate Fairyland.
No, actually, I love it. I'll steal it all. I told Jason the other day, I was like, man, I love when people start seeing really, really deep things in fiction, because I just start taking it, and then I tell people that same stuff, like I came up with that.
I have to ask, because and spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read the first arc, spoiler alert, that you have your warning, the first arc of I Hate Fairyland, but the ending of the first arc completely, like, people say all the time, like, oh, this blew my mind, or whatever. You completely like destroyed the idea of your own book at the end of the first arc in some ways. Like, it was crazy. Like, she went from getting exactly what she wanted for forever to becoming the queen of Fairyland herself. And it was such, like, I was just like, oh my God. Like, that was like, there was a part of me that was like, oh my God, that was so mean to Gert, as if she was like a real person. But like, how does that change your approach to the second volume? Because it's like, you kind of hit a reset button. Like, there's not that quest element that was in the first book, the first volume.
Well, again,
I don't want to spoil anything, of course, but
yeah, I don't want to get too spoilery, but I'll just say this. Well, first, I'll speak to the ending.
Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, because I was convinced, because I don't think that I'm like a super plotty writer. I think that I'm a very apparent, like transparent on the surface, predictable writer that just has fun drawing and making quips and things like and bad puns. So I thought from the beginning, I was like, man, everybody's gonna see this ending coming from a mile away. So if you notice, like, I just was like, I'll just keep whatever. And I thought for sure people would see it from a mile away. So the fact that it actually got people, I was like, that's crazy. Well, okay, I'm gonna ask this, and this is all I'll say to how I'm gonna deal with that. Do you watch The Good Wife?
I do not.
Okay. For anybody out there who watches The Good Wife, see Hickman. If Hickman listens to this, he'll know what I'm doing. The Good Wife always ends a season like, you know, there's 6 or 7 seasons in or something like that.
Yeah.
And me and Jason Howard talk about this all the time. And we literally use The Good Wife as my example, as my reasoning why what I'm doing is okay.
That's hilarious. Like, I would never think, you know what, the piece of fiction that's most closely associated to I Hate Fairyland is The Good Wife.
Which I also need to say that I think The Good Wife is maybe one of the worst named television shows on the planet.
It's not great.
I mean, that's saying that, and you don't watch the show. When you watch the show, it really does, like, past the first part of the first season,
not so good anymore.
The show's never, I mean, I love it all, but the name doesn't make any sense past that.
That's what I mean. Like, she isn't necessarily always such a good wife. So
no, it's not even about her being a wife. That's not even the show anymore. Like, that's the crazy thing. I mean, she is a wife and she is married but the show is not about her being a wife, like, at all. I mean, that is part of her world, is that she is a wife and there's trouble and stuff like that. But that's never, that's like, the point of the show is not like The Good Wife. So it's just like, man, what an unfortunate name for a show. But anyway, that aside, my little Good Wife name rant aside, it's the way that show deals with their season finales and their season openers. If anybody's watching this, or if anybody, whoever's listening to this that also watches The Good Wife, they may now be able to predict what I'm going to do. But that's all I'll say. Watch season finales and season openers of The Good Wife, and that's exactly how I'm going to figure out how to deal with my book.
I'm looking forward to, like, that's on ABC, isn't it?
I have no idea. I watch it on Hulu or something.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, it's like they're going to, like, analyze the numbers. They're like, why did all of a sudden people who are extremely interested in comic book fans or comic books start watching The Good Wife? Whatever. No, it like, I want to go back to you saying that, like, you thought I was going to be transparent. I didn't even think, like, I just presumed that the book was going to continue to be about her quest and her just going from situation to situation. So, like, once it got to the point where she had, like, her challenger and, like, she was, like, the other kid that was going to get the key and everything, right, that was, like, super elite at it and was just, like, crushing Fairyland because she was, like, being nice and stuff. I didn't until that moment really think that you were going to address, like, that in the first volume. I thought it was just going to be like, oh, well, this kid's gonna get, like, owned by some giant or something, and Gert's gonna continue on her quest. And then you got to the 5th issue, and it was just like, what?
Now, see, now you see what I'm saying. Like, that would have been a perfect place to end. You know?
Oh, totally.
You know, if sales weren't good, I could have walked away very happy that I told exactly the story that I always wanted to, which was, you know, look, what you put out in the world, you get back, right?
Yeah.
So she's kind of bad at this quest, and then she eventually becomes, like, you know, and you are not the first person that was like, oh my God, you were so mean to Gert to do that to me. I was like, Gert's not a good person. Like, she's a terrible, terrible person. Like, so I've always got to be careful. Like, that's one of my goals, is like, I want her to do stuff, and she's kind of crazy, but in the end, she can't, along the road, I got to remind myself to make sure that she doesn't get rewarded for it. For her to be able to get what she wants, she's going to have to eventually do something good, and so until that day, every now and then we've got to remind everybody that, like, hey, I do know that she's a terrible person.
Yeah. I think I realized for sure that she was a terrible person when she saw mushroom people and she's like, I'm going to eat them. Yeah. And I was like, what's that?
It's kind of funny that you said that, because it's like, I think the way that she views that world is
they're non-people.
Yeah, it's almost like it's like, I'm trying to think of a good analog to it. It's like, I don't know, it's like if you go to like remember old Showbiz Pizza, right? And Chuck E. Cheese.
Oh yeah, totally. Like the animatronic people?
Yeah, like Showbiz Pizza was an early one. It was like this weird, scary bear. It was like these like
they were
like,
always scary.
Yeah, they were like basically like a hillbilly band, like a hillbilly band of animals, anthropomorphic animals, and it's kind of like that, right? Like if you lived in a world where you saw that happening and eventually it's real, but at the same time, you're not ever going to treat it like it's a human. Because it's not. So it's like this for her. She's in this weird place where she's like, I got here through a hole in my bedroom, like a warp zone in my carpet. So already there's a real tilted existence here. I don't know what is going on. And then, of course, listen, anybody who knows that if you drink too much or eat too much of the wrong stuff or whatever, your body chemistry is all messed up. So yeah, I genuinely don't know if she's like thinks she's being a bad person or just being like, it doesn't matter. Like these things, none of this is real.
Yeah, it's like living in a video game. It's like she went to Tron and she was like, whatever, these are like pixels. I can just kill them. Ain't no thing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that was the thing that I thought was so genius about the ending was the fact that it was so perfectly in character. Of course, she's gonna be like, fluff you, I'm out, and like get her vengeance as she's rolling. And I don't know, I thought that was like, as somebody who is both shocked by it but also is like, that makes sense. Like she's not going to go out with her presence not being felt. Right. I don't know, I thought it was great, but at the same time I was just like, damn, Skottie, you hate Gert. What's up with that? Okay, so I this is where I bring up my super weird thing that I warned you about. Okay. I was reading another interview that you did, and you were talking about how you were going to look into why royalty and evil rulers are always in empty rooms with just thrones. They're always in these like super sparse worlds. And I just wanted to share that my friends and I we decided while we were having a bad movie night where we were watching the movie Blood Rain, with U-Ball, directed by U-Ball, which is an abomination. No, yeah, have you seen it?
I've watched it, yeah.
So you know how Ben Kingsley's always like, basically every scene he's just on his throne and he's just in this empty room being like, oh, we gotta stop her, blah, blah, blah. So we came up with the real reason why these people are always in their throne room. And at least for Blood Rain, we decided that the reason why is that is actually the only toilet in the entire kingdom. And it's his throne. And so, oh my God. So my friends and I, for some reason, we decided that was the case. And we're like making up like dialogue for the scenes where Blood Rain's screaming at him like, I need that toilet. And so anyways, that's my theory as to why it's going to happen. But
I wish I would have talked to you before I did all that.
Well, then you could put the toilet in there.
Yeah.
I do think it's funny that that's something you're going to talk about in there, because that is like legitimately something that I've always wondered about. I'm like, why? Like I like we talked about last time I played Final Fantasy games, and like you look at these these sprite like rooms for like the royalty and stuff, and it's just a chair with like a tiny little staircase and there's nothing else going on in this entire room. And you're like royalty, you should have some swank stuff everywhere.
Yeah, you should be having a dope time.
Yeah,
you should be like you should be straight. You should be straight up getting down. Like I don't like, and that's so. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know how deep I get into it or whatever. I just think it's another one of those funny things to kind of comment on, because it's like, as I'm like, okay, again, spoilers for anybody who hasn't read it, but Gert ends up at the end and she's queen of all fairyland, and of course, like one of the things that you would have to think about with a person like Gert being queen is like, will she, is she going to be a good queen or is she going to be a bad queen? Is she going to be Galinda or is she going to be, Maleficent? Like which side of that would she be on? There's in examining that, she's just kind of like realizing like, and I've realized that like, while I was trying, it wasn't even about Gert. It was about me trying to figure out how to write, like, what do I write?
Right.
And as I started like writing down, like, okay, let me write down some evil rulers, right? And or rulers in general. And I start going through all the movies that we've watched, whether it's animated or live action or whatever. And you start writing down all the rulers, good and bad. and then you think about like, okay, what stories do you tell with them? And you realize none of them do shit. Like they all just sit in rooms.
Yeah.
It's like, man, I don't like, how am I going to tell 5 issues of Gert sitting in a room? Which I'm, spoiler, I'm not going to, but, yeah. So that's really what it came. It's just another one of those little silly observations, which, you know, going back to, you know, me kind of approaching the series moving forward in a little different manner than kind of your traditional, I don't want to say traditional, but kind of where we've got now, where we do very solid 5-issue arcs, where, you know, every issue has a beginning, you know, it's a beginning, a middle, and end of each arc. You know, moving forward, the reason I wanted to kind of jump into a little bit more kind of self-contained stories within the bigger story is to do things like that more easily.
Mm-hmm.
I found that doing my big arc, the story was on rails.
Right.
And it was very hard when funny ideas popped up or cool characters that you want to introduce pop up in your head.
Like, how can you get it in there?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you have to introduce in completely new threads, and that's difficult when your story, when, you know, it's like on a roller coaster. You cannot go anywhere that there's not track.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of wanted to do something, you know, moving forward that kind of felt a little bit more like the comedy books or the older comics that I kind of grew up reading, which is more like Gru and you know, even you know, again, I think most comics back then were much more single issue based, and it wasn't until, you know, every now and then you stumbled upon an arc or something like that, you know. But anyway, so I thought that was things like the throne thing, or different little areas that I want to examine that don't necessarily fit and serve a greater narrative. Are the things that made me decide, like, nah, you know what? Like, maybe the first 5 issues of Fairyland were my movie. Yeah. And now moving forward, I've entered into my television show, you know? So it's like, that's kind of my mental state of how I'm approaching the book now versus the first 5 issues.
Yeah, no. And I really like that, because it's like, you know, it really fits like the comedic nature of the book. Not that it's just like pure comedy or anything like that. I mean, it's mostly comedy, but you think about like a lot of comedians, and like a lot of what they do starts with like bits. It's like they have an idea and then they build from that. And like, you know, I was reading that you were like looking at like Final Fantasy as like a possible inspiration for like the next arc and stuff. And so like you can work off of things like that, or even just like a simple idea like the throne room. And it's like that doesn't have to define an entire issue, but it's like you can explore elements like that, and you can like extract the tasty nougat from inside of it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's very much that. I mean, because here's the, like, to do all the things that I want to do with a book like I Hate Fairyland, which, let's face it, I Hate Fairyland is not probably going to be around for 100 issues, right? Like, it's like it'd be cool. But
it's not going to be like, you know, like Fables, like I was talking about, where it goes 150 issues and ends with a trade paperback or something.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know how long this is. I'm at least probably going to go 4 trades, at least, you know. So, you know, 4 or more, but somewhere around that zone probably. But because of that, I'm like, okay, I've got all these different ideas and inspirations. So let's set up a way of storytelling that lets me get to all of them now, you know, instead of going, okay, like, oh man, Final Fantasy is cool. I'm really inspired by Final Fantasy today. So let me write a story where I've got to deal with that inspiration now for the next, you know, year and a half. Instead, I'll go, I got a funny few things to that I want to do with a Final Fantasy-esque tale. I bet you I could get that in 28, you know, 25 pages, right? Or 26 pages. And I've also got this idea, you know what, man, wouldn't it be cool to do like a Frank Miller land, you know, like a Sin City style land? Like, man, but see, now how would I fit that idea if I had a 5-issue arc that was dealing with, you know, a Final Fantasy-esque thing? It wouldn't make a lot of sense now to all of a sudden try to wedge in a noir story in the 3rd issue of that or whatever. Or, you know, I've got an issue where, you know, one of the issues of this arc, we're going to find out, you know, throughout the issues, we noticed, like, where does Gert get all of her, you know, every time she has an item, it's in Larry's hat, right? And because I designed Gert, the way I designed her, and then I realized like, oh my god, I need her to have stuff, but I don't want it to, like, she's too small to carry this stuff around all the time, just visually. So I was like, I need to put it somewhere. So I was like, oh, Larry has a hat. We'll just put it in Larry. We'll put it in Larry's hat. But I was like, there's a lot of stuff in that
tiniest hat.
Yeah. So I was like, so there's an issue of this, the next issue that I'm going to write is talking about the inside of Larry's hat, so it's an issue about what that's like imagine you've seen, they have pulled dragons out of that hat. Mm-hmm. They've pulled axes out of that hat. They pulled, hand mirrors and all types of stuff. So who knows what it's going to look like if you actually enter into it. Right. Mm-hmm. So again, like I'm having these ideas. So I just have a list on my phone, and I just, every time an odd fantasy or fairy tale-esque idea pops up, or any idea pops up, I write it on that Fairyland list. And then I just look at it, I'm like, man, I've got 100 different ideas here. And I'm never going to do this book long enough to approach them all in a way that feels natural if I have to do, here's an arc where this is the one, it's like she is doing this for this arc, or she's doing that for that arc. And all of a sudden it's like every one of these I can pop maybe one or two of these ideas within the kind of structure. So this way it was like, no, man, I could get in here and have, the cover of the issue that's getting ready to come out now has Gert wrapping up her hands, right? And the name of the issue's Put Your Quarter Of, so it's, let me just say that today, I finished that issue, and I finished writing that issue, and let's just say I listened to the Street Fighter themes, the Street Fighter theme songs all day today, while finishing that. So it's that kind of stuff where I'm like, it kind of even goes back to your first question about like, do you really enjoy this? And I'm like, fuck yeah, man, I super enjoy this, because I want to set myself up to, if I'm going to run my own ship or be the captain of my own ship, then like, God damn it, I'm going to steer that ship wherever I want it to go, whenever I want it to go there, and that's again saying like, I can do that because it's my book and I'll do whatever. So it's like, have fun, be inspired now, and do that book next month, because I know what it's like to feel like I'm inspired now, so I'll plan to do this next year or after. And because while I was working on, I think it was issue 3 of the first arc, I was listening to The Sword, and a Sword song came on. I was like, God, this is so good. And all of a sudden I had this idea, and I was like, oh man, I want to do that. And I was like, damn it, I'm at least 4 months away from that. I'm at least 4 months away from being able to even fit that in. But the idea that I have right here doesn't even work for the first. It doesn't work that I couldn't be able to do that in the first issue of the next arc, because it needs a setup, and then the setup, and all of a sudden that inspirational idea is all of a sudden part of this like weird structure that I have to put together. When now the way that I'm kind of approaching it is I write down, where it's going to start, and where it's going to, what kind of that last issue that like this is 6 and 10, right? So that's
so it's like there's like the bookends basically, but
yeah, so
in between there you get an adventure.
Yeah, it's like, here's where I'm starting, and here's where I kind of want to. Here's kind of where I want to take this out at this trade, and then here's a list of possible ideas that can work within it. And then, and listen, naturally, once you start writing, even when ideas are random, you find ways as you're writing, they start to connect. Like my issue 7 has something that has an idea that I had since the issue 1, and I've had it, and I reformed it into something else. And then all of a sudden in issue 8, I had no plans for this to connect. It was going to be a completely separate issue in a way. And all of a sudden, just naturally, the things start to tie themselves together, because the characters are the characters and the world's the world. So naturally, these things start to kind of, you're like, oh, wow. You start to feel like, again, this is silly, right? Because I'm writing and drawing comic, because you actually go like, wow, I kind of feel like a writer. Like I think I just wrote something today,
Well, you know, and you were talking about the comics when we were like kids and stuff like that. And like, I remember when I was a kid, like when they would do like the arcs and stuff like that, where like 3 or 4 issue stories and stuff, those would feel like really special because a lot of times like you just be reading these one-offs. And like, that was one of my favorite things is like, I loved it when I was a kid and like, you know, you'd have like this random character appear and you're like, oh my God, this character's here. Or like there'd be, you know, like the little boxes like previously in like Uncanny X-Men 265 or something like that. And then you're like, what happened there? And like, I don't know, it kind of sounds like you're kind of going through the experience of building the connective tissue, but like not with intent. Like it's like working that way because you're crafting it, and you're kind of not saying you're making an X-Men comic or something like that, but it's kind of like you're saying, more like the comics when we were kids. And not that like today's comics are bad, but
yeah. Oh no, it's and that's what I'm saying. Like that's what I wanted to highlight earlier is like all the things I think sometimes too often when we talk about things, we kind of lay them, you know, they can sound like we're laying them out there as if this is how all things should be.
Right. Yeah.
But
that's
a lot of these, yeah, this is literally just how I look at not comics, but just how I look at my comics, you know, like, because I absolutely enjoy Saga that has this giant, you know, who knows when it's going to end feel. I absolutely love East of West that has this giant, I don't know when it's going to end feel. I love all that stuff. So this is just kind of stuff about the way that I like to make comics and the way that I like to consume some of the comics. And so for me, it was the same way. Like I remember reading comics and just feeling like, yeah, cool, or, you know, reading Gru or like I said, Spawn or X-Men or whatever, and then or Generation X. And then you remember when you'd get to the ones that actually said part 1 of,
you're like,
and
what?
You're like, oh, like this is, you know, whoa. Or
I need
even
next month right now.
Yeah, because all of a sudden, you know, the characters that you've been diving into and out of, and being introduced to all types of characters, because again, the story's not bolted down to tracks. It can weave and take different roads and go to the alley and all of a sudden jump away and focus on a whole different character. Because of that, I think that it's a way to kind of like let the characters develop over time and listen, develop for me, like reveal themselves to me, because a lot of this started as a concept, but I'm completely prepared and hoping that as I work on these, that it becomes something that I didn't know that it would be. And I think that we've seen that. I think we see that in most entertainment. I mean, you know, if you watch the beginnings of, I don't know if you're a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, but
watched a little bit, haven't watched that much.
So, you know, Buffy was that same way. I mean, the first couple seasons are kind of silly and like, I mean, it's all kind of silly, but, you know, the change between the first seasons and the later seasons is just huge. You know, all this, it found what it was, and the characters became, you know, who they became, and started kind of probably dictating the story for the writers of the show. And that's kind of what is already, you know, I'm seeing that just in the infants, you know, in its infancy through in my second arc is like, you know, expanding Larry a little bit, you know, and introducing my favorite thing that I'm doing now is I'm introducing new characters more easily because I'm not sticking myself on rails. You know, like there was a couple characters that I thought, man, I thought of that I would love to throw in the first arc, but it just didn't make any sense. And they would have robbed pages from the plot. And you know, and that would have felt clunky and overburdened. So, yeah, it's fun. It's fun to just feel like let's add it here and do it there. And then I think when we get to that moment where I say, you know, part 1 of, then it's like, oh yeah, here it is.
You know, so a podcast that hasn't aired yet, but I recorded at Emerald City this year, was with two guys, Brendan Fletcher and Carl Kerschel, who have a new book at Image called, I'm going to mispronounce it probably, but I apologize, guys, Isola. And I was talking to them, and they were talking about how Carl did this webcomic called The Abominable Charles Christopher, which was like one of my favorite books. And like he was talking about how one of the things that they're going to do in Isola is like while it's going to have like the central thread of like the story and stuff, like they want to have room in there to kind of meander and go to some places that like, you know, that they're not really planning on. And I like that. Like I think that, again, like, you know, it's not like not every comic has to be the exact same way, but just in the same way, it's nice to have some comics that, you know, like you're saying with I Hate Fairyland, you're finding out where you're going and who's going to be involved as you're going along, because it's like, I can tell you, even with like, you know, even if you did say like the first arc was more on rails than the second arc will be, like reading that, and you could tell in my voice probably, I didn't expect a lot of it. Like I was like, I was overjoyed with like having an experience that felt like completely like, I don't know, I didn't know where I was going to go next, and I was having a blast finding out.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, first of all, I am super excited for their book coming out. And I don't know if you know this, but Carl and I have kind of been tied together since pretty much the beginnings of our careers.
I did not know that.
Yeah. 15 years ago, 2001, my first comic book that I ever drew and got paid for was at Marvel Comics on Iceman #3. Mm-hmm. And that was a fill-in for an issue that Carl could not do.
Wow.
So that's we literally go back to the beginnings of our careers. So we got to hang out a good deal at Seattle this year, and it was great. Anytime we get to reconnect, it's fantastic. And we were, and I actually got to meet Brendan for the first time, and we both were kind of like, oh my gosh, you know, because those two have been friends for 30 some years, I think. Yeah. And so it was like, again, like Carl's kind of been this, he's basically a part of my story, right? Like every time how'd you break in? Like Carl's always in my story. Yeah. So it was really cool to kind of meet, you know, somebody who's I've also known as part of Carl's story. And he's just as good as guy as Carl. I mean, I think Carl's one of the best guys on the planet. I love that guy. But, you know, I'm excited for that book. But also, going back to what you said, like what he would do on Charles Christopher was great, right? Because he'd have the story.
You did a comic in Charles Christopher. I forgot about that.
I did. Yeah, I did one of his when he'd have guests, people come in and do stuff. I loved that. I loved that he would do that. I love that every now and then he'd jump off and do like the history of the bear, and he'd do these little profile stories and things like that, and just kind of do a pause or a break. And the thing that I like about that, and I think that again, this is what I like to, I don't want to say experiment with, but or testing, but I mean, that may be closer to what I'm talking about is seeing, you know, are people cool with just supporting creators, you know, like, especially when they get to more singular minded. And I would consider even Carl, you know, their book to be closer to that because they've been friends for so long that I'm sure that it's almost closer to a hive mind like book at this point. I don't want to speak for them, but I can imagine that they know each other so well. But that's definitely definitely a book like me, you know, a book from me or anybody who writes and draws their own stuff. I mean, I know for one, I mean, like Brandon Graham, if he does stuff, I just go with it. Like I don't really, it's like I'm just interested in what his mind does. I don't really when I read a book of his, I don't view it in the same way that I do a book that's meant to be, you know, told in 3 acts, you know, that kind of follows the 3-act structure or you know, does what. And I love those books, but I don't read it in the same way. I read it I'm just there for him, and so I give him a lot of rope. I give people like that a lot of rope because it's fun to see what they do. Like Fabio Moon and Gabrielle Ba, when they do books, they get a lot of rope from me because I just want to see how their minds work, and I'm entertained by how their minds work. So again, I'm talking about from a fan, like Jeff Smith, he could do whatever he wants. I like to see how his mind works. I don't need his book to live up to the same way, you know, to books that are done, you know, in a different way. And that's kind of what I'm hoping with a book like Fairyland, or I'm sure what Carl and them are hoping to do with their book is that same thing, which is, hey, if you buy into me and you show me some trust, we'll see if we can't have some fun together, you know? Yeah. And I can't promise that everyone's going to be a home run, but I can promise that I'm going to try to make it a home run. I'm going to swing very fucking hard. You know?
Well, it's funny because, like, I talked earlier about how that sequence with Larry and like having his family and building the cabin and yada 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 and burning it down and everything, like that was
Right.
one of my favorite moments. But you talk about something like Brandon Graham, and like I look at like King City, and like there's some moments in there that like I remember, like I really like this one spot where like I don't remember the name of the main character, but like he was going to a vending machine, and Brandon just meticulous, like he detailed like what was in the vending machine and had like little like lines pointing to stuff. And like,
Yeah.
I remember reading that and I was just like, I think a lot of times like in stories you would skip a moment like that, but it was like because of that moment I was like, okay, this book is different. I like this. This is something special. And then like with Carl, and it was funny because like I think Brennan thought that our podcast was going to end up just becoming a Charles Christopher fan podcast, because like there's this one random story or like one random comic that Carl did in Charles Christopher that was like like a group of migrating geese, and like there's this one line in it where it was this goose says whenever we're traveling, I'm thinking about being at home, and whenever I'm at home, I'm thinking about traveling. And it like really spoke to me in that moment. And it was like, obviously, like there's a lot of goofy stuff in that book, but I mean, it was just like this random insight into life from a migrating goose that like meant a lot to me. And it's funny how like, you can find those moments. You can find that like the really great stuff in comics when you kind of are just exploring your own story and your own characters and your own world.
Right. Yeah. No, it's completely true. And I mean, it's something that I remind myself to find ways to put it in without feeling like I've shifted the tone too much or all of a sudden I'm being, I think those moments are hard, and I think Carl's really, really amazing at it. And I'm attempting to do that here and there with even Gert in a book as silly as this, which is, again, at the heart of it, a person who was kind of taken from their home in something that was supposed to be fun and or not taken because she wished that she could go there, but went to another place and can't get back home, and so she's frustrated. And I've got moments coming up in issues where her and Larry will say to each other like, "Hey, listen, be honest." Like, she thinks she's be honest. You'd miss me a little bit if if you actually got home or whatever, and she'd be like, he'd be like, you'd miss Fairyland. Like, admit it, there's a part of you that doesn't want, that's what Larry says. There's a part of you that doesn't want to leave here. Mm-hmm. And she says, there's a part of you that doesn't want me to leave here. Mm-hmm. So they're both kind of admitting like, we hate each other and I hate this place, and Larry can't move on until she's gone. And so even if it's just a quick, brief moment of reminding, like, they still probably like each other, right?
Yeah.
Probably. I mean, we don't know that, but like even people that get on your nerves, at some job, you're at your job and I haven't had too many real world jobs. But there's still the people that you get on your nerves, but they're still your people, Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of things to try to do to that. And it's definitely a tough challenge, and I hope that I can get better at it and insert some more things like that. And that's another thing that I hope to be able to grow at and learn as I do this book, longer and try to figure out what she is and where she's going,
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited to see where it goes. This conversation has just got me more excited about reading the next arc.
Thanks, man.
So release them now. but
I'm trying.
Get back to work, Skottie. What are you doing? But anyways, no, that's actually all I have for you. I was actually going to go in a few other directions, but I feel like this is a perfect place to stop. Thank you so much for chatting with me.
Oh, I appreciate it, brother.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel from Sketch.com. You can find this week's guest, Skottie Young, on Twitter at Skottie Young, on his site at SkottieYoung.com, and his work in I Hate Fairyland at Image Comics and a whole bunch of covers at Marvel. You can find more sketch content at Sketched. That's SKTCHD.com. Follow us on Twitter at SketchComic. Like us on Facebook at /Sketched. And if you're listening on iTunes, give us a rating or review. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.